Welcome everyone. We have a really good turnout. Thank you all for coming. I hope everybody was able to sign in and get some food. My name is Penelope Van Pyle. I won't stand in the projector. I'm the Associate Director of the Honda Center for Human Rights and International Justice, which is hosting this talk today. I'm really honored to be able to introduce our speaker today, Christoph Safferling, who's a really formidable scholar and a longtime friend and collaborator of the center and of my boss, our faculty director, David Cohen. Dr. Safferling holds the chair in criminal law, criminal procedure, and international law at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, and he is also one of the vice presidents of the Advisory Council on the International Nuremberg Principles Academy. Today, he's going to share with us findings from some really extensive research that he undertook into the post-war establishment of the German Federal Ministry of Justice and the German experience with lustration practices post-war and in the transition to the modern German state. We'll have an opportunity for some question and answer at the end, but he'll start by giving his presentation with his findings. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Safferling.
Thank you so much, Penelope, for the warm welcome, and thank you all for showing up. I'm really impressed by this crowd. I guess whenever you have the word Nazi in the title, you know, it's just easy to show up. What I'm going to do is now, for the next 15 minutes, to tell you the story of the Rosenburg, and this is very much this building which you see here. It's an interesting looking monstrous villa on the edge of Bonn, which of course was the German capital until reunification in 1990. And the Federal Ministry of Justice indeed was situated in this place. I mean, you must imagine in the late 40s, early 50s, Germany and indeed Bonn being destroyed by the war, so you were, you know, suffering for facilities, and there was this little place still available, and this is how where the ministry then found a place to be. It was actually built in the 19th century by a professor of paleontology. I don't know, but at that time obviously professors were better paid. Anyway, I'm going to tell you about this research which I had the honor and pleasure to undertake. It was demanded by the Federal Ministry of Justice. We started in 2012. We, that means a colleague of mine, an historian, and me being a lawyer. You see him on the right hand side here. That's Manfred Görtemaker from the University of Potsdam. And it was the then 2012 Minister of Justice, Sabine Leutheusser-Schnarrenberger, down here, who initiated the study and asked us to look at all the personal files of all the staff, the personnel that worked at the ministry starting from 1949 up until 1973. The later Minister of Justice, Heiko Maas, who of course now is our foreign minister, you might have come across this face in international news. He then was the Minister of Justice, and he then presented our final report, which we handed down in 2016. So 4 or 5 years even of intensive research, which I'm going to present. We had several conferences in between. It was very important for us and also to the ministry to do this in a public discourse. We call this public history, that we don't sit in our rooms and, you know, draft some sort of reporting, but we continue this from the very beginning on to be a public process, a public enterprise. So we had several conferences. You see one here in the European Academy of Berlin, and another one from the House of the Wannsee conference, actually, which is now a documentation center. Whenever you happen to be in Berlin, you know, don't miss that. Go down to the Wannsee and look at this very impressive house. So in this room, the Wannsee protocol was actually, the Wannsee conference actually took place, where the final solution to the Jewish question was sort of put down in paper. So we had these conferences discussing with other experts because, as you might know, it is a goal of the German government to actually look into this area, this time of the establishing of the Republic of Germany, in particular with regard to the Nazi past. It is now in our coalition treaty that several ministries, ideally all of them, have similar studies. And the first one that was actually underway was from the Foreign Office. Our former Green Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer, he initiated a study in 2005, and the report was published in 2010, was very distressing for the German public at that time, the results that the colleagues came about, and so, you know, other ministries followed, and we were, so to speak, the second, and others are on their way. So we had discussions going on with colleagues on our finding and their findings, and compared the different studies. So what I'm going to do now in the next 45 minutes, I'm first going to present to you the two heads of the department which I'm talking about, the Ministry of Justice, the minister and his deputy. And then I'm going to talk a little about the general dealing with the past policy that was approached by Germany after its foundation. And thirdly, then I'm going to focus on the actual personnel, on the staff, and give a broader overview, and then going to talk a little about individual biographies and what they actually dealt with before and after the war. So when we start looking at these two main figures who were running the ministry and obviously deciding who would be employed to work at the ministry, we have these two persons here. On the left-hand side, you see the first Minister of Justice, Thomas Dehler. On the right-hand side, the picture is Walter Strauß, his deputy. Thomas Dehler, interestingly enough, he comes from the town of Bamberg, and he was a practicing lawyer in his hometown. And he actually was married to a German Jewish wife. And I don't know whether you are aware of this, but when you are, as a Jew, aware at that time, as a Jewish person married to an Aryan non-Jewish person, you were in a so-called privileged marriage. For me as a lawyer, I have to admit it's always very difficult and strange to talk about legal things in such a way. I mean, how perverse is this? You know, to identify a marriage as privileged because one of them is not of a certain race or religion or whatever. But that's where the law, this was the outcome of the Nuremberg race law of 1935. So he wasn't in an awkward position, but his wife would have been. But due to him also sticking to this marriage, both of them survived with difficulties, and keep in mind they had a daughter. She was half Jew, so she also had difficulties in that time. But they came around and survived the war in Bamberg. Him being a practicing lawyer with very close connections to the Jewish community all through the war, and he helped wherever he could his Jewish friends. Walter Strauß, now this is very, very coincidental maybe, but that was the other way around. Walter Strauß himself comes from a Jewish background. His parents were Jewish. He himself converted to Protestantism, but of course you know what this means. So he was considered still to be a Jew. According to the race law. And again, he was in a privileged marriage because he was married to a German non-Jewish wife. And he started actually out working for the Reichsministry of the Economy until 1933, when all of the Jews were driven out of office. He had to leave, but he knew sort of the ministry from the inside, which might be important for his behavior after the war, so he knew how civil service worked in Germany, and obviously he appreciated the bureaucratic structure in Germany very much. He survived the war with difficulties, but due to his privileged marriages with friends also in the Berlin region and after the war, He then became also involved in politics. He was one of the founding members of the CDU, our conservative party, the Christian Democratic Union in Berlin. He then worked for the occupation administration in Frankfurt. He was head of the legal office of the bizonal administration in Frankfurt. So those were the two persons who obviously are not sort of suspect of being Nazis. Quite the opposite. I mean, they were in some way or other were they persecuted and had difficulties during these 12 years from 1933 to 1945. But now they had to decide on whom actually to take on to, fulfill this new democratic constitution, this liberal approach with life. And whom now did they choose? Well, what they found were sort of two sets of lawyers, so to speak. One you could describe as these little Fritz Bauers. I don't know how famous Fritz Bauer is in the United States. He's a very famous person in Germany indeed. He was a Jewish judge in 1933. Also, like all the other Jews, he was driven out of office. He then fled to the Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Norway, where he lived through the war. Then in 1945 he came back and became a public prosecutor, first in the city of Braunschweig and later on, and this is where he became very famous, he was a general public prosecutor for the federal state of Hesse in Frankfurt. So there you are. This is a group of persons who, being persecuted by the Nazis, had to immigrate. And so, it would have been sort of a logical thing to do to ask those, and there were thousands, also highly educated and well-trained lawyers, to come back to Germany to help establish the new state. So that would have been one group of people. Not that many, but there were at least a certain number of them around. By the way, Fritz Bauer became extremely famous because he staged what you here see on the left-hand side, the so-called Auschwitz trial, which took place in Frankfurt before the regional court there, starting in 1962, where for the first time, really in German history, a set of SS members who worked at the concentration camp were prosecuted by a German court. And he sort of staged this trial, being the prosecutor responsible at that time. So that would be one group of people. The other group of people would be the little Freislers. Roland Freisler probably is known to you. You see a picture of him here in front of the swastika. He was, of course, mostly known for being the president of the so-called Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, this notorious Nazi special court to try, resistance persons against the Nazis. He handed down one death judgment after the other. He was an extremely unworthy judge, unworthy person. And of course, he couldn't be prosecuted after the war because he was killed in a bombing attack in I think in April in February 1945. So he wasn't there to be prosecuted, but some others were. And you see a picture here on the bottom right of the Nuremberg of one of the Nuremberg follow-up trials. You know, of course, that there has been this Nuremberg trial, the main trial, the first ever international criminal trial that took place 45-46, where the most notorious and most influential and still alive Nazi criminals were prosecuted. And then thousands of successor trials took place, and 12 of them in Nuremberg, in the very courtroom where the first trial took place, These not being international trials, but solely under the authority of the U.S. administration, the occupying administration. But nevertheless, these 12 follow-up trials became extremely influential in the process of developing international criminal law further. And at that time, obviously, they were extremely interesting, because what the Americans did was that they focused on the German elite and put together sort of trials that would represent one or the other group. So there was a trial against doctors, there was a trial against ministries, there was a trial against SS members, there was a trial against lawyers in particular, the jurists trial. That was the third trial that took place. There were also trials against militaries, obviously. And you see a picture from that where we had a mere half dozen of accused who were high-ranking German lawyers at that time. Most of them coming from the Reichs Ministry of Justice. And you see here standing the then deputy minister, Franz Schliegelberger, who was sentenced to life imprisonment by this American military tribunal. And others were also sentenced to high imprisonments. None of them was sentenced to death, actually. That's also quite interesting. Whereas SS members and generals and others were, also sentenced to death by these tribunals, none of the lawyers were sentenced to death. But those sort of, so to speak, was the other group of people that you could choose from. People who, in one way or other, had, been part of the regime, of the Nazi terror regime inside the ministry, or as judge or as prosecutor. So there you were. Those is sort of the two groups that they could choose from. Now, coming to my third point, I wanted to go swiftly through the general atmosphere in Germany with regard to National Socialism at that time. So we are in 1949. Okay, so we're in 1949. We lost the war in 45, and then there were 4 years of occupation where the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and of course the Soviet Union tried to reorganize and restructure civil life and administration in Germany. And there it was in 49, a constitution was handed down, our German basic law, the Grundgesetz. And in September 49, we had the first general election, the first German Bundestag, the parliament convened, and we elected the first chancellor. On the left-hand side, Konrad Adenauer. Being together here actually with Hans Klopke, who later on turned out to be his deputy, his state's secretary, as we call them. And he also has a very interesting Nazi past. Adenauer himself was persecuted by the Nazis, so, but his deputy was very much part of the administration of the Nazis during these 12 years. Now, in 49, what's happened with the ongoing prosecutions and the dealing with the many Nazis that were still around? Two things I want to mention here. One of the first things that, and indeed that was the first ever law that the Federal Department, the Federal Ministry of Justice helped preparing, drafting, that was an amnesty law, okay? So, Gesetz über die Gewährung von Straffreiheit, the amnesty law, which was passed shortly after Christmas in 1949, so the first year of the beginning of the Federal Republic of Germany, and it was called the Christmas amnesty. And it did not pertain to murder or killing by Nazi laws, but it did pertain to minor criminal offences, in particular in economic situations, but it didn't exclude the amnesty of Nazis. So for minor crimes like denunciation, for example, my neighbor is hiding a Jew, something like that. That could have fallen under this amnesty law. So this sort of represents this one sentiment that you would actually rather grant amnesty instead of looking at it and prosecuting Germans for their crimes before 1945. And the other one here on the right-hand side, you see a document of something that was also decided on in autumn of 1949, the establishment of a special unit, which was also for the first years actually within the Ministry of Justice authority. And this is the Zentrale Rechtsschutzstelle, as it's called in German, the central agency to protect. And what did they protect? They tried to protect German POWs abroad. So first of all, we would say that's a general service that you would maybe your government expect to provide, that you have the POWs who are still abroad, and mind you, in the Soviet Union there were still thousands of Germans under not so nice circumstances, but also in France and England and even the United States you had POW camps. So to help them and to seek refuge and so forth, that's certainly a good thing to do, and you would expect the government to do that. But at the same time, it was sort of also within the realm of this central agency to warn Germans whenever they heard about a prosecution going on somewhere abroad. Don't go to France, they're looking for you. Okay? So that's a very interesting scheme that developed within this agency that they undertook, by the way, with a great support of the German section of the International Red Cross Committee. Very interesting, this combination here. But they did help many German Nazis to evade prosecution by, receiving warnings from them. So putting this together, you can tell that in the German society at that time, and definitely in the government structure, you had the atmosphere of, forgetting what has happened, trying to help those who are still being prosecuted, but, let's shield ourselves from further prosecution and let's go on with our life. And this can also be shown by the prosecution rates. So you don't have to look into the details here, just to give you a grave overview over the prosecution numbers. Prosecution of Nazi criminals, of course. This is an overall figure, so it's also the Allied trials that started with the Nuremberg trial in 1945. And this is a sketch timeline 45 to 1970. And you can see three things. First of all, here this red arrow shows that with the foundation of the Federal Republic of Germany, the numbers dropped dramatically. This is at 49. If you want to have the absolute numbers, we are talking about 100,000 investigations that were going on. And we are talking overall of not even 7,000 convictions. Okay? And more than 4,000 of these convictions took place in this timeline from 45 to 49. In other words, the Federal Republic of Germany only managed to convict about 2,000 former Nazis in the time, they started also from 45 to the 1970. It always came to a standstill after the federal government was in place, and then you see this, it's going up a little, starting from 1958. What happened there? What happened was that a trial was staged, the so-called Ulmer Einsatzgruppenprozess. It was on a handful of SS members, part of the Einsatzgruppen. Those were those police squads that were operating, in particular in Eastern Europe, behind the front line, and killing every Jew and Gypsy and those kind of person that were around in gas lorries, and what sort of perverse things they invented to kill as many as possible. Those are the Einsatzgruppen. And there was an incident in Stuttgart, and one of the prosecutors decided to make a case. So he went ahead, and all of a sudden there he was indicting several former SS members, and there was obviously a major uproar in German society, and so the politicians had to do something about it. And what did they do? They established another office, the Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes. So that now was not a federal office, because due to our constitution, prosecution is not a matter of the federal government, but rather the states. So that was a combination, you know, the authorities of the states, they put together their authority and had created an office where they would, in a common enterprise, investigate Nazi crimes. So that was founded in 1958. Taking a step back here, do you see the schizophrenia behind that? I was just telling you about this agency that was there to protect Germans from prosecution, and now you have an agency that should actually investigate. And you could imagine that they didn't really fit together, and they were at odds all the time. The one of requesting, you know, information from the other that the other wouldn't provide, and so forth. So anyway, this is, as I said, a very schizophrenic situation, and it's not only in the government structure, that was in the entire German society at that time definitely the case. So, and then in 1968-69, you see the figures dropping again and coming down to a complete standstill, actually. Even though we are still taking on trials as we are speaking. You might know that, you know, even now, Germans now obviously being in their early 90s, being prosecuted for crimes that they committed in concentration camps, particularly in Auschwitz and other places. So what happened in 1969? Well, in 1968, the Federal Ministry of Justice presented legislation, presented a draft of a big law that had, you know, to do with basically regulations on street traffic and so forth. It was a huge law. And a part of this was a little amendment of our criminal code. It's very difficult to explain the details how that worked. But because of this little amendment in the criminal code, the statute of limitation would apply to most of the Nazi prosecutions that were underway. That we just started in '58 with the new agency. Most of them had to be terminated in '69 after this law came into force and after our Supreme Court or the Federal High Court of Justice decided that that would actually, in the consequence, that the statute of limitations would apply to most of these Nazi prosecutions that were actually underway. So after that, it came to almost an immediate standstill. The person who was responsible within the ministry was this person, Eduard Dreher. Now, he was extremely famous in that time after the war because he was one of the he wrote and edited one of the main commentaries to the German criminal code. You know, we have a codified system, so we have these codes, and then people write commentaries to this code and explaining article by article and section by section what this article and this law actually means. And he wrote one of the most influential ones. Influential meaning it was on every judge's desk, virtually on every judge's desk. And he was the responsible deputy head of the department of the criminal law section at that time when this law, which led to the, you know, statute of limitation application, when this law was passed. Now, what you see here, by the way, is sort of the front page of a personal file that we would have looked at. So you find a picture, mostly, you find the name, you find his birth, and on page 5, interestingly enough, you find that section where they actually had to, you know, identify themselves with their affiliation with the Nazi Party. You see here, NSDAP, National Socialist Party. He became a member on the 1st May in 1937. And he was member of some subsections, this being the Lawyers Association of the Nazis. So what I'm saying is that they all had to, you know, to open their own record, they all had to identify themselves as being Nazis. So nobody can say now that the ministry didn't know whom they were employing. They all identified their Nazi membership. Most of them most honestly said what they did and where they have been, because obviously nothing happened to them. You know, they weren't afraid of confessing that they were a Nazi party member. Another thing that's also interesting is de-Nazification. You know, you had to identify that you went through de-Nazification process, which most of them indeed did, and it was required. And he was identified category 4. This is called Mitläufer, you'd say co-runner. So, you know, he was not totally unaffected by the law. He was not against National Socialism, but he sort of was a co-runner. So that would be the category with which you could still be employed by the new federal government. You know, if you were category 3 or higher, you wouldn't be allowed, but with category 4, you would still be allowed. It doesn't surprise you probably when you hear the figures that 97% of all Germans were identified category 4 or lower, and only very few indeed were categorized in a higher category and couldn't proceed. So this is the story, a little story here of Eduard Rea. At the time of National Socialism, he was prosecutor at the special court. This is also not the ordinary criminal court, but a special court that was established by the Nazis to try, according to their laws and their ideology, in particular political crimes, in a smoother and faster way from their understanding. And he was a prosecutor. Not by coincidence, he applied to get there. Okay, and that was in Innsbruck, which of course, ever since 1938 was part of the Reich, although it's now obviously in Austria and has been before. So he was a very prominent figure there, and we will come to speak about this a little later, what the individual cases that he had to deal with at that time. So the statute of limitation thing in 1968 and 69 abolished almost all prosecution of Nazi criminals. So coming now to my next point, talking about the personnel that was actually then employed in the Federal Ministry of Justice. Of course, you don't have to, you know, be able to read this now. It just should give you an impression of what we are talking about here. This is an organizational sketch. It made our work indeed much easier that these kind of sketches were around ever since 1950. So from the very year one onwards, they produced these sketches, and they identified people, the names of the people that were responsible for these units. Okay, you see, you had these 5 departments, one being the central administration, the first being the general administration, and then it's private law, second is criminal law, law of the economy, and then administrative law and constitutional law. So those were the sections at that time. You see, there were not that many units and sub-units. Altogether, we have looked at more than 200 personal files in our research, and 170 of them were actually employees at the ministry in that time from 49 until 1973. And it was, as I said, easy for us because we could identify the persons that we were actually interested in because we had these sketches. Now, this is a sketch of 1957, so in the 8th year of its existence, a rather sort of elaborate and comprehensive structure was already in place. And now when we look at the overall figure from that time, you see the timeline down here. The blue one indicates the general development of the staff. We started out with 35. There were 35 lawyers. We only looked at sort of those with a legal background that were working in positions where they had actually some authority, right? We had 35 lawyers. At the end, we had 93. So when we look at this time altogether, we come out with a figure of 53% former Nazi Party members working at the ministry in that time. That might overall maybe not so shocking, but if you look at the year we've just looked at, in 1957, we had, and you see this here, a figure of 78, almost 78% of former Nazi Party members working for the German Federal Ministry of Justice at that time. There were 23%, and this is the bottom line, were members of the SA, the Sturmabteilung. This is a special paramilitary organization established by the Nazis very early on. There were sort of their stormtroopers. we had a decent amount of membership here too. Where we didn't find, or only with a very irrelevant amount of figure, is SS membership. So we didn't have anyone in that amongst them who were working in a concentration camp as a member of the SS, which is good news, I would guess. But you know, the figure as such of membership in the party is distressing enough. I'm happy to discuss maybe later on the relevance of a Nazi party membership, you know, because obviously you can read this in different ways and people had different motivations to become member of the party. But now let's just take the figure as it is, and I'm going to talk in the coming minutes on individual careers, and you can maybe see more what that meant for one or the other. If we, by the way, look at the sketch again here, and we look at the head of the departments, we find an interesting moment. At that time, 1957, we had of these 5 persons that were heading the departments, none of them was a former Nazi party member. 2 of them, the one here in the middle, Erzig was his name, and Joel, they were half Jews, and the first here also was not a member of the Nazi party member. Right, but they were at that time already very old. They were all 3 of them were born late in the 19th century, and so they retired early 1960s. And when they retired, they were all succeeded by former Nazi party members. So then in 1964, the head of the departments were 3 party members, and those 2 that I've circled around here were not. And this is Josef Schaffer, he was the department head for the criminal law department, and then Walter Römer, who was heading the constitutional law department. Those were the only ones in '64 that were not party members. And I'm going to talk a little about this last fellow, Walter Römer. What did he do? Him not being a party member. I love this picture, right? I'm not saying why, but you could maybe read this. He really looked that way. I've seen other pictures. Anyway, he was not a Nazi party member, but he was at that time, from 33 to 45, working as a public prosecutor in Munich. And he was actually responsible for the execution of sentences, which is not the most favorable job you could imagine in the prosecutor's office, but in that time you were also responsible for the execution of their sentences. So that was his duty. And now, interestingly enough, whenever we spoke, and we did as much as we could to contemporary witnesses, obviously those kind of people were not alive anymore when we undertook our research, but there were those who worked for them, you know, were old now, but they still knew them, and they had experience with how the life was at that Rosenburg in the 60s. Whenever we talked to them, all of them told us that we never spoke about National Socialism, and we didn't know any stories. None of them was a member as far as we know, but him. They always pointed to him, saying he was a member, and he actually killed Hans and Sophie Scholl. I don't know whether you know of the resistance group, the White Rose, but there was a very famous resistance group who in the early 40s handed out leaflets against National Socialism and against the war in Munich. There were students at that time, and there was a circle of, I don't know, a few people together with some professors who organized some sort of resistance. They were found, denunciated, they were brought to a speedy trial before Roland Freisler. You remember the picture I showed you from the People's Court, Volksgerichtshof. They were tried and speedily and executed the same day in Munich. That was Hans and Sophie Scholl, the main figures of this resistance group. And now everybody in the ministry claimed he killed them. He killed them. Well, interestingly enough, this story wasn't true. I can tell you because I've seen the execution protocol of Sophie Scholl. That's that one here. And it states here that responsible for the execution was Reichsanwalt Weiersberg. And the true story is that it had to go so quickly that the Reichsadministration and the Volksgerichtshof didn't bother to get the Munich authorities involved. They did it themselves. Okay, so that story that everybody has been telling us wasn't even true. But Walter Römer had a hard time sort of justifying what he did and claiming that he was not responsible for that. And indeed, if he would have only supervised the execution, I mean, he was not responsible for the death sentence, you know, but he would have supervised the execution in the prison of Stadelheim. So anyway, he was part of the administration, he was part of the judiciary at that time, being a prosecutor and being responsible for the execution. Most interestingly, and this is also what sort of was one of the criteria for the people to be elected to become employee at the Federal Ministry of Justice, were former experience in the drafting of laws, because this is what a ministry does in Germany, you know, help drafting laws. And how can you prove experience? The best way you can prove that you've worked at the ministry before. And this is what you can prove, or can be shown here, that at sometime early in the 1950s, we had half of all the members of the new government, they've already worked for the old government in the Reichsministry of Justice. But this is something that they wanted, that was looked for, experience in that regard. Now, when we look at the, in particular, to give another example, at this is the Department 2. This is criminal law. I'm a criminal lawyer myself, so you can understand why I was so interested in particular in this Department 2, doing criminal law and criminal procedure. Now, those are the members of this department, and on the left and on the right, I have identified their affiliation with the Nazi system. You can see all of them were Nazi Party members. This is also from 1957, all of them. And all of them had some place in the former administration or the judiciary. You have at least two who were junior consultants in the Reichsministry of Justice, this one here and that one here. And of course the head of the department. Mind you, I told you just a minute ago that this head of the department was not a member of the Nazi Party, okay? But I'm going to tell you his story now. That's Josef Schaffer. And you can see again here, you know, he wasn't a member. He was a member of the Lawyers Association, but that was sort of a natural thing to do, and that's not so important. But he wasn't a party member. And this is obviously what, after the war, he always carried in front of him, like, you know, I don't know, something holy, saying, well, I wasn't a party member, so you can trust me, you know. And indeed, something else in his life happened. He was working for the Reichsministry of Justice, okay? He was working for the ministry until 45. And after the war, he then was taken on by the East Berlin administration to help establish the administration, until at some point in late 45, the Soviet Union decided to incarcerate all former members of the Nazi government. So he also was brought to a detention camp, and actually he then spent 3 years in Sachsenhausen, a former Nazi concentration camp, now on behalf of the Soviet Union and the occupying power in East Germany. So then he came back in 1947 to West Germany, and he became again a member of the prosecution in Freiburg, and later on he came to the Federal Ministry of Justice. And there, those were the two things that really went in his favor. He could say, I wasn't a member of the Nazi Party, first. Second, I was persecuted by the communists. So I'm really an anti-communist, and that is what we need right now. Anti-communism in the German society, as it was here, I suspect, in the United States, was the super glue for society. You know, if you couldn't identify with anything but, you know, being anti-communism, but being anti-communist, that would hold the strings together. So he could prove that in both ways he would be the person to rely on. Now, when you look at the personal file, it's interesting, because in 1942 you discover that his career suddenly stopped. I mean, he's worked within the federal government, within the Reichsministry of Justice, at some time also with the judicial department of the Wehrmacht, but he wasn't promoted. And he wasn't promoted, obviously, because he wasn't a member of the Nazi Party. So what did he do? He applied. Okay, he applied for becoming a Nazi Party member. And a letter was written back to him saying, well, we can't take you on because you're too Catholic. And you come from the political Catholicism was sort of something that the Nazis were afraid of. And you come from that background, you have that background, so we don't want you in our party. So he complained. And he sought the help of Roland Freisler, who at that time was his boss in the ministry. You know, think of Roland Freisler, a very prominent figure in the Nazi regime. And he complained. And he complained by saying, you know, that he himself isn't Catholic, not at all, and you know, even if his parents were Catholic, that's not, you know, his fault, and he's super National Socialist and he wants to become a member of the party. This is the way he complained, you know, on 8 pages he goes on and on and on how he should be a member of the Nazi Party. They didn't take him. They didn't take him. And now, in brackets, that does tell something about the importance of the Nazi Party membership, doesn't it? Because they didn't take on everybody. You know, they looked at the persons, they looked at their careers, and then they decided. And some of them, like him, they didn't take them on, even if they complained, and even if they were a member and a reliable member of the administration. He wasn't allowed into the party because he was not sort of one of them. He was considered to be the Catholic, to be an outsider. So there he was. Nevertheless, of course, after the war, he told nobody that he wanted to become a party member, but he said that I wasn't. And this is why he became such an extremely influential figure. Whenever you had a problem, in particular with your own past, you could always turn to him and he'll help you out. Okay, he'll write a nice letter saying that, oh no, you're a very reliable person. Nevertheless, never mind that you've spent time at the Volksgerichtshof or someplace else. You know, he would be the one to turn to. Okay. Now, for the next couple of minutes, I can, if you want, tell you about some real scandals that took place after the war in the Ministry of Justice. And the first one is this person here, Max Melton. Now, Max Melton, as a matter of fact, he only was employed at the Ministry of Justice for a very, very short time, for 6 months. Allegedly, they discovered what had happened before and they asked him to go. That he wasn't sacked or anything. He left voluntarily, but allegedly he was asked to go. Well, he was before he was working for the Ministry of Justice. He was a member of the party since 1937, and then he was transferred to Greece, where he worked in Thessaloniki for the war administration, the German Wehrmacht administration at that time. And as such, in 1944, he organized the deportation of more than 50,000 Jews to the concentration camps, together with Dieter Wislicheni, who was later then prosecuted in one of the follow-up trials, and Alois Brunner, you might have heard of. He was definitely the right hand of Adolf Eichmann. He was never found and was never prosecuted. Why is that? Because he was helped by this organization that I was telling you about. He was warned against prosecution that was underway, and so he abducted and made it somewhere to Lebanon and Syria. He showed up there as being a military advisor to the Lebanese government, as far as I can remember. That somehow his life remains a secret. But this is the person he worked together with in the deportation of the Jews. After the end of the war, he was shortly brought to Dachau and held there as a POW. And then in 1952, he made it to the Ministry of Justice. He was employed there by about 6 months, as I said, then he was asked to leave. And then even if he was asked not to go to Greece because he was warned that they were looking for him, he went to Greece to sort out some private business. Not really clear why he went, but he was arrested in 1957. So far, so good. But the interesting thing is, and you see, I mean, even if the ministry asked him to leave, that would actually be a good thing. You know, they discovered that they made a mistake, and then they asked this person to leave. He shouldn't be part of the administration. But what happened then doesn't show that they were of that good spirits in the ministry, because they sent, they initiated what I would call a rescue operation for this Max Melton. They sent this person, Ernst Kanter, as a chief negotiator to Greece. Ernst Kanter himself, as you can see here, he was a pre-1945 chief military judge in occupied Denmark. All the death sentences that were handed down by military courts in the occupied Denmark were signed by him. You know, they all went over his desk. After the war, he became then part of the judiciary and was at the Federal Ministry of Justice until '58, when he was promoted to become a federal judge at our High Court of Justice. So he was sent, so a very prominent figure of the ministry at that time, he was sent to undertake these negotiations in bilateral talks with Greece. They even went to the Greek king and tried to get Max Melton out of Greece to avoid prosecution and trial there. And they promised everything they could, you know. They even promised that they would try Max Melton at home themselves. Of course, the Greek government knew that that wouldn't happen, because nobody was prosecuted, particularly not lawyers, were prosecuted by German courts. So they actually didn't extradite him, and he was sentenced to 25 years of imprisonment by a Greek court. But then in '59, he was released. He was not released, but he was extradited for further execution of his sentence to Germany, where, as a matter of fact, he was immediately released. There was a further trial then underway, but in '68, this trial again was discontinued. And mind you, he was even paid compensation for the suffering of pre-trial detention in Greece. So altogether, a rather sad story. Another continuing career that we have to cope with is Franz Maasfeller. Franz Maasfeller is very much one of those responsible for drafting these laws, these pervert laws, which I've talked about at the beginning, about the privileged marriage. So he helped drafting the race laws, and in particular, he wrote a commentary on the race laws, the Nuremberg race laws. You can see that here. On the right hand side, in several editions, he explained, you know, article by article, what these race laws meant. He was also not a member of the National Socialist Party, but he was leading the family law unit since 1934 in the Reichsministry of Justice. He was also a member of some sub-council for the Akademie für Deutsches Recht, one notorious Nazi think tank in Munich, to elaborate and establish Nazi laws. In 1936, as I said, he wrote this commentary on the Nuremberg race law. In 1942, he was participating on one of the follow-up conferences to the Wannsee Conference, which of course dealt with the final solution to the Jewish question. In 1949, then, after the war in the De-Nazification process, could you believe that? He was actually declared not to be not affected by the law, notwithstanding the fact that he did all that. And then from 1950 to 1964, he was again serving, this time for the federal government, and mind you, for exactly the same unit that he did before. He was also heading the family law unit in the Federal Ministry of Justice. And I have a third one for you. This is also a person, Heinrich Ebersberg, who I like that picture too, because that was actually taken in Nuremberg. He was not prosecuted in Nuremberg, but he was acting as a witness on behalf of one of the defendants at the jurist trial. In that time, this picture was taken of him. Heinrich Ebersberg. He was a member of the SA, and since 1933, and then from 1937 onwards for the Nazi Party. And he was the personal assistant to the deputy minister, Franz Schlegelberger, the one who was convicted to a life sentence in the Nuremberg jurist trial. He was his personal assistant. In 1941, he participated in a T4 conference. You might or might not know T4. This T4 project was the euthanasia program, part of the euthanasia program established by the Nazis, and the Reichsministry of Justice was involved in so far that they barred anyone participating in this program from being prosecuted by an ordinary court. So he was part of this. And he was, as the assistant to the minister later on, responsible for a program that was called Correction of Insufficient Judgments. So that's a very odd thing. But whenever the government, the Reichsgovernment, learned of a proceeding and a judgment that they were not happy with because the sentence was too mild, they could intervene. Okay? They could intervene and decide without further trial, without further hearing, that this particular convicted person was to be brought to a concentration camp. Okay? And execution of the sentence would have taken place in a concentration camp, which by the end of the day meant death through labor. I mean, that was the idea of not the death camps of Auschwitz and Sobibor and others, but the camps in Germany. Most of them were sort of established to exploit the workforce to such an amount that those people would actually eventually die. So that was the sentence then. It was definitely meant to be a death sentence. So he was responsible for that program. In 1949, he then became a judge at the regional court in Lower Saxony. In 1954, he was a member, then again, of the Federal Ministry of Justice, and he was the deputy head of Department 3 for economy law, and actually he was the only one where we could find some sort of reaction to the allegations which were then brought forward, that he'd been such a person in the Nazi time. He was not asked to leave or anything, but he was not promoted. And indeed, he was halfway through, if you wanted to put it that way, degraded and not deputy head of the department, but he remained sort of the head of the ordinary unit for economy law. The prosecution actually that were established against him, criminal prosecution that were underway, had to be terminated. Why? Because of the statute of limitation that applied, because his colleague from the other department initiated that law that would then eventually lead to this result. So there you are. Those three careers of people who have worked for the Nazi government